I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Douglas Murray tonight as our guide to help us explore the possible futures that may lie ahead of us. Mr. Murray is the Associate Director of the Henry Jackson Society, a think tank that works across borders and party lines to combat extremism, to advance democracy, and to make a stand in an increasingly uncertain world. He previously founded the Centre for Social Cohesion, a think tank studying extremism and terrorism in Britain. He is an associate editor of The Spectator magazine, a columnist for Standpoint, and writes frequently for a variety of other publications, including the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Murray has spoken on a variety of prominent platforms, including the Oxford Union, the Palace of Westminster, the European Parliament, the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, and the White House. We are honoured that tonight, Wymondham College Chapel joins that august list of venues. And I have great pleasure in inviting Mr. Douglas Murray to give the 2014 Lincoln Lecture.
Well, thank you very much for that very warm introduction, and thank you all for turning out on this very not warm evening, and for the invitation and the honour of addressing you tonight. I'm going to propose to speak for around 30 to 40 minutes and then leave as much time as possible open for Q&As in case anything I say tonight has provoked you to any questions. Or perhaps there will be complete unanimity in the hall, I suppose we'll see. But the title I've chosen for tonight, The End of the Anglo-American Era, is, I think, a timely subject, and one which I hope to be able to cover in the time I have. But I thought I'd start by saying the following. I've got into the habit in recent years of taking my annual holiday in January, which I much recommend, by the way, to anyone who can do that. You disappear from the worst of the British winter, come back after the taxman has taken all your money, and it's February. It's a wonderful, wonderful innovation. This year I went to Vienna the other week and spent some time thinking about empires and eras as I spent a very enjoyable time around the relics of the Habsburg Empire. As those of you who know the city know, one of the greatest and highest cultures of the modern era. Extraordinary city and extraordinary culture. And at the end of that week, I went to the place where the Habsburgs are buried, the vault of the Habsburgs. Some of you have probably been to the Kaisersgruft in Vienna. And there you can see, as you descend, a rather disappointingly car park-like entrance for the public. There you see, when you go down, row after row of Habsburgs, from the beginning of the dynasty. I was going to say from the lowest Habsburgs, there really weren't any. From the earliest Habsburgs, you go past the tomb, they're all in enormous bronze caskets, row upon row of them. You go past that of Charles VI, with on every corner of his tomb there's a skull with the imperial crown on its head, and the skull stares mockingly at you. You go past them, past Maria Therese and her husband, carved on, expecting celestial joy. They've woken up into celestial joy. It's a beautiful, beautiful monument. You go past Franz Joseph and Sisi, his wife. I mention this because at the very end of the vault, the tombs of the Habsburgs, there are a couple of empty places still, and there's one that was filled only a couple of years ago. Otto von Habsburg. He was the last person to have been born to be the Emperor of Austria. His grandfather, of course, everyone knows, Franz Joseph. There's a picture of Otto, who was born in 1912, sorry. There's a picture of him as a 4-year-old boy at the Emperor's funeral. Of course, his own father was the last of the Austrian emperors. Lasted only 2 years. And however, Otto lived on and only died a couple of years ago in 2011. He had through his life, ended up, and I will not editorialize on this point, as a member of the European Parliament. What a falling off was there. I mention Otto von Habsburg, an extraordinary life, 1912 to 2011, for one reason only, really, which is to remind ourselves of how much can change and does change in the course of an ordinary human lifespan, and how much certainly changed during his. An unimaginable amount over the course of that century, over the course of that lifespan. I mention it because it is something I think whenever one is thinking of empire, whenever one is thinking of history, has to be borne in mind, which is that permanence is an illusion, but it's the illusion of absolutely every age. The 4-year-old Otto von Habsburg would have assumed in 1916 that the Austro-Hungarian Empire would have been going on. Anyone would have done at that point. If you were an aristocrat in 1770s France, it would have been hard to imagine that the world would fall about your ears within a few years. It's the same with every era. It will doubtless be the same with our own, and one can already see some of the shifts, which I'll get onto in a moment. I have 2 favorite examples of the illusion of permanence, which always interest me. One which should give pause to members of my profession is a great book which is little read these days and has been little read for many years, published by a man called Norman Angell in 1908. It was a book called The Great Illusion, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. And The Great Illusion was a bestseller, went through multiple editions. And the main argument of this book, one of the most popular of its time for political ideas, was that warfare between European states was now impossible because it had become so economically unviable. It was a hugely persuasive book, sold out, as I say, edition after edition. There was, by the way, a final edition published in 1919. I've always wanted to get hold of it to see what the new afterword says. But Mr. Angell wasn't alone. There was a huge amount of optimism in those days, as there always is. A huge amount of hubristic predictions. The Encyclopedia Britannica that came out in 1911 is my other favorite. Under the entry on torture, it makes clear, among other things, it says that this is now something which is unimaginable in modern Europe. Torture is part of the past, not something that's going to be part of our present or future. As I say, the illusion of permanence is always with us, and it is, I would argue, with us today as much as ever. We in this hall are all extremely lucky to have grown up in a period of stability which owes its stability, I would argue, to one thing in particular, which is that we have not grown up under any Habsburgs, but we have grown up under the extraordinary era of Anglo-American dominance. At a time when that is often talked down, I think it's always worth reminding ourselves of some of the basic things of what that includes. The Anglo-American era, the Anglo-American democratic ideal, relies on a whole range of things, but among them, and not least among them, is the significance of democratic institutions, of checks and balances, of democratic accountability, of the validity and indeed possible virtue of free markets. It relies on stability of governance, which is extremely easy to take for granted until you see some of the alternatives. And it also relies, and I would stress this one, I'll come back to this, on an extraordinary and unparalleled concept of secular liberalism. That is the extraordinary inheritance that the Anglo-American world has got, this brilliant twin tributaries that have created this civilization. The first from the great Greek and Roman empires, and then that of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Of these two, the first is perhaps more often nodded to today than the second, I've just been reviewing a new book for The Spectator on how liberalism came about, and the author has one very, the author is Larry Siedentop of Keble College, Oxford, has one extraordinary insight in particular. He says that to even credit the significance of the Judeo-Christian tradition on secular liberalism today is to commit something that many people think of as heresy. But it is impossible to disentwine our tradition from that. And that, I would argue, finally as a point on that, that is one of the things that has given rise to the culture of rights. We often, of course, today hear negative connotations around the terms of rights. But the fundamental human rights that were nurtured and indeed explained in the Anglo-American world, particularly after the Second World War, is something, again, which is an extraordinary inheritance, which even if they are universal, as some of us believe them to be, are ones that have been argued and led by the Anglo-American world. When we talk about the Anglo-American world, of course, one thing in particular has to be stressed, which is that normally when an empire falls and another one rises, it is an extremely messy process. There is not usually a neat handover. And one of the reasons why we can even still talk about the Anglo-American era is because the handover was almost seamless in historical terms. This was not the handover of one empire to an entirely different empire. It was a handing over of a tradition from the English-speaking peoples to a cousin of the English-speaking peoples, to a part of the English-speaking peoples. There are two things I always bear in mind in thinking of that point. The first is the extraordinary moment in 1940 when Winston Churchill sat down literally just outside Oxford, the home of the trees, and he was sitting down with the American ambassador to the court of St. James. And an extraordinary moment. Churchill was, of course, spent the whole weekend arguing for American assistance at that point in the war when Britain was alone. And there was an extraordinarily moving exchange between Churchill and the American ambassador on the Sunday evening of that weekend, that crucial weekend in 1940, when Churchill obviously wanted to know what the ambassador was going to say when he went back to Washington and spoke to the president. And the ambassador asked him into a room in the house and simply quoted Churchill from the book of Ruth. And he said to Churchill, I thought you might be interested in knowing what I'm going to say to the president. And Churchill signaled that he would indeed be interested in that. And the ambassador said, whither thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge also. And thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. And then he paused and added, even to the end. And Churchill broke down in tears. Now, a few years later, the British Empire, British dominance in the world, was clearly at an end. The Second World War exhausted the United Kingdom. We spent a quarter of our national treasure. We were an exhausted power. We obviously had a future as a country, but we had no future as an empire, or indeed as anything like the dominant global force. And I trace the moment where this handover, this moment of transition occurred, to a moment in the winter of 1947. And that was the moment when the British government informed the Truman administration that we had run out of money for Turkey and Greece, and responsibility was now in the hands of the Americans. And as I say, if you reflect in historical terms on the other alternatives that would have existed in literally one country handing over economic responsibility for another, you'd be very hard pushed to come up with anything quite so smooth as that. And of course, the American part of the Anglo-American era had, I would argue, enormous advantages over that of the English, the British part of that. Because when the American era began in fullest force in the wake of the Second World War, America did something which I would argue is unparalleled in the history of empires or of dominant powers. And here I always think of a wonderful thing that Colin Powell once said in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War, when a French official said something extremely crude, I think, about America and her ambitions in the Middle East and elsewhere. And Colin Powell rightly pointed out, he said, America is because he was being criticized by this French official for creating empire. And Colin Powell pointed out, said, if that were the case, that this is the first and only empire in history which has gone into country after country and not asked for a single bit of land other than the space to bury the dead they've lost on the way. That is an extraordinary thing for any empire, any dominant world power to do, to be involved in the world, but not to be expecting or requesting to own the parts that it goes into. And that bit was, I think, something which, of course, the Anglo part of that era did not do. Now, Tony Blair, who gets a somewhat bad rap these days, and not entirely unjustifiably, gave one of what I think is one of the most important speeches on this subject. He gave a speech which I much recommend to those students of you to read in Chicago in 1999. The Chicago speech of Tony Blair is a quite extraordinary speech. It was after interventions to stop the ethnic cleansing in the Balkans and successful intervention in Sierra Leone. And Tony Blair said in Chicago a crucial thing, which I wanted to reiterate tonight. He said, of course, all empires rise and fall. We all know that. Anyone who looks back on history knows that. There is always a rise, there is a period of dominance, and at some point there will be a fall. As Tony Blair said, that Britain knows that very well, and one day perhaps America will know that as well. The question, though, is what you leave behind, what the empire leaves behind. And that's one of the things that I think that America, and indeed during the period of the Anglo-American era which we're in now, is worth dwelling on. There was a moment, some people would now say, again, a somewhat hubristic moment at the end of the Cold War. There are people, don't know if any are present, but there are some people today who look back on the Cold War almost with affection. Things seemed so simple then in a way. I don't think it felt like that at the time, and I think very few people who were engaged and actually understood what was at stake in the Cold War would share that. But there's something understandable about it. It seemed so clear in a way. And of course, when the Soviet Union, the totalitarianism of communism, was so finally defeated, the hubristic moment was the belief that we had arrived at, a very misunderstood term, but the term that was arrived at was that of the end of history. Francis Fukuyama started off with an article called The End of History, ? And it then became a book called The End of History, no question mark. I think in that small punctuational detail, much of the misunderstanding lies. But the end of history was not so wrong as all that. The claim, and I pretty much go along with it, was that at the end of the Cold War showed an extraordinary thing, which was the triumph of Western-style liberal democracy and free markets, the complete triumph of them. That did not mean that every single country in the world had become, or even would become very swiftly, such a system. But the dominance of it on the field of intellectual and moral argument really was irrefutable. Now today, as I say, I think that can be seen as being somewhat hubristic. History has returned, as many people have pointed out, and we've already got the revenge of borders, the revenge of geography, apart from anything else in the Middle East and elsewhere. And before going on to some of those challenges, I would just point out that, of course, there is a very a fertile history of declinism in the West and in the Anglo-American sphere. There have been so many predictions of the decline of America that it's possible to make a small shelf, quite a large shelf in your library, of books which have made claims one way or the other. We had James Burnham in the 60s We had many people who said that there was going to be an overpopulation problem. There were people who said there'd be an underpopulation problem. There were people who said that the globe was going to become so hot it would be unbearable, and some people who said it would become so cold it would be unbearable. It is a fertile area, the area of declinism. But there is undoubtedly now, as there always has been, a set of challenges in the world, and particularly challenges to the era of American dominance. And I would put those in two different spheres. The first are the undoubted challenges that come from without. And let me just focus on a couple of them for a moment. The first, which is one I think that has rightly had a lot of attention in recent years, is the threat that is perceived to come from Islamic fundamentalism. And let me say from the outset, I don't by any means underestimate this threat. Nobody who spends any time looking at it, I think, could. But I think it is worth bearing in mind that it is not a serious competitor to the Anglo-American view of things as a moral set of values. It is not a serious values threat. It is undoubtedly a serious security threat, and I think will be for many years and perhaps decades to come. But there is very little doubt, I would argue, that in a competition between a system that allows the most thriving of individual freedom of any in the history of our species, and one that actually takes every effort to limit human flourishing, that the latter cannot survive as a battle in the battlefield of ideas. Of course, there are some people who have said that during the period of the last 12 or 13 years, that somehow America has let herself down or let her values down in the fight which it's necessarily involved itself in. And although I don't want the only mention of Abraham Lincoln tonight to be, as it were, a slightly negative one, I think it is always worth remembering that during the post 9/11 period, Barack Obama said that America had compromised some of our values, some of our basic values, he said. Yet nothing that the Bush administration, or indeed the Obama administration, have done since 9/11 in the pursuit of Islamic extremists who would threaten our way of life, nothing they have done compares with, for instance, FDR's internment of American Japanese, or indeed of Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus. I mention those things for a particular reason, of course, which is to remind ourselves that in the pursuit and the necessary furtherance of a country, and indeed a country's existence and its security requirements, we have, and America have historically often done things that have in the short term been needed in order to secure a longer term security. So as I say, I think Islamic fundamentalism is a security threat but not an ideas threat. However, there is, and this has to some extent been exaggerated again, but is worth concentrating on for a moment, the issue of China, which has, I think, poses a very, very different issue. The question that China raises for the Anglo-American era is a much more serious one in many ways. And that is not because I see China as an outright enemy or anything like that. But there is undoubtedly, through particularly the flourishing of China's economic model and its extraordinary growth, a question which the democracies are starting to ask themselves. I don't think it's an unhealthy question to ask, but I think it's worth pondering on, that the idea that the free market and freedom in a democratic model necessarily go hand in hand has received a challenge in recent years. There is no doubt about it that China and the Communist Party of China that runs the state is an entirely authoritarian power. There's no doubt as well that it has ambitions. Not everyone can agree by any means on what those ambitions might be. But I think that the very idea that the economic success of China at least should make us think about our own system is not entirely unhealthy. It's a challenge, and I say a challenge rather than a threat. Apart from anything else, for all of you who are students at the moment, a fact I can't resist making, and I think it's a healthy point to remind you of, is that for every one of you students here tonight, there are 28 Chinese students of the same age, all working just as hard, or possibly harder still, in order to attain a lifestyle which you and I have been lucky enough to take for granted. And that, in the years ahead, will, I think, undoubtedly be something which will be an issue. Now, I mentioned that some of these challenges and thoughts and indeed concerns come not just from without, but also from within. And I think I spend a fair amount of my time in America. I think it is possible to sense certain murmurings of discontent. There is no reason to think that they are terminal, but there are certain reasons for feeling concern at the moment, murmurs and whisperings. The first is, I think, for a completely understandable reason, which is the same reason why Europeans should be somewhat concerned at the moment, which is that America, like Europe, is living far beyond its means. And this is a huge challenge for this generation. Angela Merkel summed it up, I think, very well recently in European terms when she said in an interview with the Financial Times last year, one of the great challenges that Europeans face is that we are responsible for something like 12–14% of the world's economy. And we expect more than, we actually spend more than half of the world's output on welfare. And if you try to balance that, you'll see again, we in Europe have been living far beyond our means, and it's going to be extremely difficult in the years ahead to encourage people to see that that is possible only for a certain period of time. But as I say, that is something that exists in America as well. And let me give you just one quick example of that. China has, of course, enormously benefited from buying up US debt in recent years. One fact I think can't be forgotten enough, remembered rather enough, is that if China keeps buying US debt at the rate it has been in recent years, by the end of this decade, the interest payments that the US pays will fund the entire Chinese military every year. It's an extraordinary position to be in, but worth pondering. The other reason I would suggest where there is a murmur and concern is undoubtedly in the foreign policy field in America. President Obama recently said that America was war-weary and was tired after a decade of war. Secretary of State John Kerry said a very similar thing. We've heard this here. Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne said it recently after the failed Syria vote. I think this is worth highlighting for a couple of reasons, but the first is this. It is worth considering. We have been here before, and America has been here before. People often talk about what America is going through at the moment as something like the post-Vietnam syndrome. But something that's worth considering, if we make that comparison, is this. There's been an extraordinary sacrifice by American and Allied forces in recent years in Afghanistan, Iraq, and around the globe. But the losses, and very significant they are, but the losses of American troops in the last decade have been 1/10 of the losses over the period of the Vietnam War, which was the last time people talked about this war weariness. And of course, this is with a volunteer force. And Vietnam was with a conscripted force. Now you can see how, after the terrible period of the Vietnam War, you can see how that war weariness would very swiftly have got to every family potentially in the United States, because everybody knew somebody who had been called up or conscripted. Now, that has not been the case in recent years. When I'm in New York or the West Coast and somebody tells me they're tired of war, a lot of these people know nobody who have been involved in the armed forces in the US or elsewhere. And I slightly meanly sometimes say to them, what are you tired of? 10 years of the same story on CNN? There is something concerning, I would argue, for those of us who believe that we need American leadership in the world. If America at this point, and after this last decade, were to seek to take a back seat, that is, of course, something that Obama has, as president, urged. He has talked of leading from behind. And I would argue that is not what the world needs at the moment. America is best when it's leading from the front, because if it leads from behind, there are many other countries that will try to seize the initiative. It's extraordinary in the wake of the Syria vote to see Vladimir Putin stealing world leadership over that. But as I say, those aren't the only things. There's a third issue, which I think causes a murmur of concern at the moment for those of us who consider and indeed cherish the Anglo-American era. And that's a more fundamental question. It's a question of values. The late Samuel Huntington, who some of you will know for his famous essay, became book, also incidentally question mark in the essay, no question mark in the book, The Clash of Civilizations. Samuel Huntington, who wrote that famous work, wrote a final work, also very, very important, I think, although underrated, called Who Are We? Very interesting analysis of America, of what we are. And of course, this issue is one that America is not alone in questioning and discussing at the moment. It's one that we in Britain are going through. Who are we? What are we? What is Britishness? You hear it in Europe as well. What is it to be European? There is, I would argue, across the whole of the West, a period of self-doubt, self-questioning, certainly. Who are we? What are we? Where did we come from? This, of course, is exacerbated by one of the virtues of the West, which is, of course, the massive influx of immigration, which brings all sorts of benefits, but undoubtedly raises that question, even in America, even the most successful assimilationist ideal of a country that's, I think, ever existed. Even in America, that question, who are we, starts to come up now when immigration happens at the rate it does in the southern states, California, and elsewhere. And I would say that there is an unsatisfactory answer being given to that at the moment. And it's one which I think needs to be addressed. Leo Strauss, the German-born philosopher who ended up at the University of Chicago, made a great comment once, which he used to describe everyone after Plato as the moderns, which is a long view, which I think is bracing. But Leo Strauss once said the moderns had been extraordinarily clever in building their philosophical terrain on exceedingly wide grounds. The only problem was that they're also extremely shallow grounds. And there is, I think, a risk and a concern which needs our attention in all of the Anglo-American sphere of stretching our definitions of ourselves too wide, of being afraid to say what we are, what our foundational values are, of being afraid to explain or indeed even to understand how this extraordinary achievement of secular liberalism happens with religion and secularism both understanding their place, both knowing the tributary from which they come. Of course, all this could change very, very swiftly. It's, as I said at the outset, a fool's game to try to predict what's about to happen, and everyone who does make a prediction on it is almost immediately proved foolhardy. But there are a couple of things I wanted to cite which are worth our consideration as I go towards Q&A. The first is a major development which I do not know what will happen as a result, but it is possible to start to forecast some ideas. And that is that in the very near future, America is going to attain energy independence. It's something which in Britain we could barely dream of. I mean, even if we paved over all of Scotland and put wind turbines on, which we could do, I suppose it depends how they vote. Even if we did that, we couldn't hope in this country to attain energy independence. But America is very nearly there. It's extraordinary achievement of the American state. There will be enormous, I think, consequences for that. Very hard to predict. It is very likely that after America attains energy independence, it will take less of an interest in certain portions of the world. It will certainly take less of an interest in the Middle East. Its interest in the Middle East has never been solely about resources, but it is undoubtedly a factor, as it is for every country, as it has been for this country. But that moment will be very striking, because this country and others, including our very close allies and allies of America, will have discovered what happens when the American tide goes out. I was speaking to an American official recently about this and asked, where will the Fifth Fleet be after America has energy independence? And he said there is no point in the Fifth Fleet remaining in the Gulf in order to protect the Communist Party of China's oil supply. It's very unlikely that that would remain the status quo, and that will have effects which will be very, very interesting to watch. So what does threaten America, as I draw to a conclusion? I would argue that the only real palpable threats to America are the same ones, and the only threats to its dominance as a world power are the same ones that all of our societies are going through and will be going through in the coming years. We often hear about globalization, and I think it's much misunderstood, much misrepresented. But globalization has an effect which we are probably underestimating, I think, in the short and long term. It's an amazing thing about the interconnectedness of our societies that we understand with the free flow of labor, the free flow of capital. We understand all the extraordinary benefits and riches that can bring. But there are problems that come from it, which are also worth bearing in mind and worth keeping an eye out for in the years ahead. That interconnectedness, which is such an extraordinary boon, is also a cause of considerable concern. When something goes wrong in the Brazilian bond markets, it's immediately felt in London. When the US subprime housing issue or American investment bank goes under, it's felt around the world and can propel the world into a worldwide recession that we're still not out of. That is just part of the downside of that interconnectedness. But I think there's something else, and I say this particularly for the students who are present, which I think is going to be a major part of your life and our lives in the years to come. And that is something which I think really demands our attention. That is the problem of what I call too much information. When I say too much information, what I mean is not just the conventional means by which we educate ourselves and inform ourselves and nourish ourselves. It's not simply that, I mean, just take Britain. 149,500 books were published in the UK alone last year. That's less, by the way, than in China or America. It's a vast amount of information, and that's just in the old manner of doing things. If one compares that to online accessibility of information, not only do you have amazing ability to connect and find out about things that took months, sometimes years, sometimes were far beyond the expectations of ever understanding a generation ago, but you also have to find a way through this, because it is so much information that it is very easy indeed to become lost in it. I heard Henry Kissinger recently in New York at a meeting where he made an extraordinary, I thought, perceptive point. He said, there is so much information today, but where is the wisdom? You can have access to any fact at the touch of a button today, and some people say the result of that is that you don't need to know the facts because you can get it. Someone will know. I can Google it. It'll be on Wikipedia. Somebody will have done it at some point. The problem is that it makes our not only attention spans very short, but it can lead to something that I think we're already in the starting stages of, which is a form of distraction instead of understanding. T.S. Eliot talks about being distracted from distraction by distraction. It was a very pertinent foresight, but also a form of exhaustion from this too much information. Not only somebody must know, but also who's to say. So many different accounts, so many different stories, so many different claims. Who are we to make a judgment? I think that, and finding a way through that, is going to become a huge challenge in the years ahead, and it's one that we will all be living with. It's a challenge for us all. So, is the Anglo-American era over? No, I say certainly not. And it can't be. It remains, I think, the best hope for mankind. It's obvious that America remains the destination of choice for people around the world. People want to go to countries which are free. There is very little migration to Yemen. There is a reason for that. There is a reason for that. And it's not just economic dominance. It is not just that. It's also about a dominance of ideas and a recognition that free markets and free people operate in the same place. I can't see an end to the Anglo-American era, and I'm very glad to say so. But if there's one thing that would cause that, of course, other than those I've mentioned, it would be if America turned away from the world completely, if it decided that the world was someone else's business. I very much hope that doesn't happen. But to just summarize, I mentioned one of my favorite stories about one of my very favorite American presidents, Thomas Jefferson, the third president. There's a wonderful story of Jefferson at the time of the Louisiana Purchase. He was going into these wild and very unpopulated places. And he was said to have been, he was on horseback, and a set of aides and others were with him, also all on horseback, and they came to a river, and a local laborer saw these men. Obviously, he needed to cross the river, and all these men on horseback went over, and the last person, who was Thomas Jefferson, the man said, "Could I get on your horse, and would you give me a lift across the river?" And Thomas Jefferson gave this man a lift across the river, and when they got to the other side, one of the presidents said to this man, "What were you doing? Do you not know who this man is? That's the president. That's Mr. Jefferson. Why did you ask him?" And the man said, "Because I looked in all of your eyes and I saw no, and I looked in his eyes and I saw yes." I think America is still the country whose eyes say yes, and I hope there's no end to that in the years to come. Thank you.